We will begin now. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you so much for coming today on this wintry day, both here in person at the GCSP and online. Thank you for attending our event entitled The Challenges of the Nuclear Arms Race in the Context of New Technologies. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Christina Shori-Liang. I lead the counterterrorism and PVE work here at the GCSP, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Sciences Po. Let me pass the floor now to Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Swiss diplomat and director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, former direct secretary general of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, who has been orchestrating and facilitating numerous dialogue events across the globe to encourage open dialogue in order to improve multilateralism to ensure greater peace and security. Ambassador Thomas Greminger, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, friends, esteemed panelists, welcome also on my behalf to the 29th Geneva Security Debate. For those not familiar with this format, Geneva Security Debates consists of public discussions on current security challenges, bringing together leading thinkers and practitioners in order to provide new insights and a better understanding of today's security challenges. It is a great honor for me to welcome you all to this important discussion on the challenge among the P5, the nuclear arms race, in the context of new technologies. We convene here to address the rising complexities of nuclear arms control and deterrence as the integration of advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, autonomous systems transforms military frameworks across the globe. These have the potential to fundamentally reshape the paradigms of nuclear strategy, deterrence, and ultimately global stability. The 5 members of the UN Security Council, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, occupy a unique position in the global nuclear order. Their actions set the tone for arms control, proliferation, and disarmament. The P5 nations view nuclear weapons as essential to maintaining strategic superiority and deterrence against adversaries. Rising tensions among major powers, particularly among the United States, China, and Russia, exacerbate distrust and make decisions on nuclear weapons risky. At the heart of today's discussion lies a pressing concern: the risks posed by artificial intelligence in nuclear command control and communication systems, NC3. AI's potential to enhance decision-making and bolster security is undeniable. But so, too, are the dangers of miscalculation, unintended escalation, and even the erosion of human oversight in critical moments. When combined with cyber vulnerabilities and the unpredictability of autonomous systems, these challenges grow exponentially, raising the stakes for triggering a new and potentially catastrophic arms race. Our conversation today seeks to unpack these complexities. How can the P5 navigate the competitive pressures of technological advancements while upholding global stability? Can they find common ground in limiting the integration of destabilizing technologies, or are we simply poised to enter an era where trust and restraint are overshadowed by competition and fear? While the current trajectory may seem daunting, dialogue, transparency, and trust-building measures remain essential. Renewed commitment to arms control frameworks, coupled with international regulation of emerging technologies could help slow the arms race and rekindle progress toward disarmament. The Permanent Five, given their unique influence, must lead by example to navigate these challenges responsibly. Let us use this opportunity tonight to listen, to learn, and most importantly, to lead. The world is watching, and the future demands nothing less than our collective wisdom and resolve. Thank you, and I look forward to an engaging and productive discussion. I will now pass the floor back to Christina Jory-Young. She will moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, for your wise words, and thank you for kicking off our event. As we have heard from Ambassador Greminger, the rapid acceleration in the capabilities of artificial intelligence has dramatically raised the stakes for triggering a new arms race. All 9 nuclear-armed states have demonstrated the interest in the development and integration of advanced AI capabilities in their militaries, with some explicitly making AI a strategic priority. Military integration of advanced AI by nuclear-armed states has the potential to have an important impact on elements of their nuclear deterrence architecture, such as missile early warning systems, ISR, and NC3, Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications. We have a very knowledgeable panel who will explore the practical realities of the governance of this new AI nuclear nexus. Please let me now introduce my esteemed panelists. Lord Desmond Brown of Ladyton is a British Labour Party politician who served in the cabinet of the United Kingdom under Tony Blair, and Gordon Brown. Lord Brown was Secretary of State for Defence from 2006 to 2008 and Secretary of State for Scotland from 2007 to 2008. He co-founded the European Leadership Network and has been the chair of its board of trustees and directors since its inception. In July 2010, he was introduced to the House of Lords. Since 2014, Lord Brown has served as vice chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Congressman John Tierney is the executive director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. He is a former 9-term Massachusetts congressman who served on the House Intelligence Committee and chaired the National Security and Foreign Affairs subcommittees of the Government Oversight and Reform Committee. During his congressional career, Congressman Tierney spent considerable time advocating on nuclear non-proliferation and national security issues. Dr. Sandeep Waslikar is president and founder of the Strategic Foresight Group, a think tank based in Mumbai, India, that advises governments and institutions around the world on how to manage future challenges. He has been personally involved in numerous diplomatic exercises to find common ground in times of crises. He facilitated dialogue between Indian and Pakistani decision makers, heads of Nepalese political parties, and water authorities in Africa and the Middle East. He's also the author of numerous best-selling books. Our debate is structured in 3 parts. The first part, we will first address the importance of nuclear weapons in the new arms race. In the second part, we will address the role of nuclear weapons in the geopolitical context. And in the third part, we will address the nexus between emerging technologies and nuclear systems. So let me begin for part 1, the importance of nuclear weapons in the new arms race. Lord Brown, are we in a new nuclear arms race?
Yes. So I'll try to treat this question more respectfully in a moment, but I just first of all want to thank those who have been working on this issue as they have clearly in a very serious way, because I've seen the framework that has been produced of their deliberations thus far, and it's an utterly impressive document. I thank the GCSP in the Strategic Foresight Group. And I am honoured to be invited to be on a panel of this, like this. Thank you, Thomas, for your words of introduction. I was not involved in any of the previous deliberations of this, and I come in at a point where I can take credit for the bits I like. And anyway, I just seriously want to say to you that I'm not, in response to this question, going to go very much further than yes, because it's pretty clear that we are, for all of the reasons that have been referred to in the introduction to where we are. But what I think we should draw our attention to for a moment or two, and I'm going to explain to you why. The other answer which I prepared, I should also say that, you know, both John and I are in an interesting position for politicians or ex-politicians to be given the questions in advance that we were going to be asked, because we prepared for this. So if you think you're only going to be here for an hour and a half, think again. When I was considering this question, I happened to be reading a recent piece by Jessica Matthews, who many of you will know, the former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Actually, it should be Carnegie because he was a Scot, and that's how you should pronounce that word. But anyway, so it was published in the Guardian newspaper, which circulates in the United Kingdom. It may well have been in the Washington Post, because I think it's quite close to the Guardian newspaper otherwise. And without, you know, rehearsing and taking credit for all of the insight that she puts in this article, I just recommend that you all go and find it for yourself, because it explains in great detail how we got here and why it's important that we get out of where we are. Encapsulates the elements, you know, of my own thinking extremely well, and I'm crediting her for this. So I'm going to draw this to a close at this stage. I'll have plenty of time to talk about this further, but she reminds us in this article of the agonizingly difficult negotiations over decades that underpinned the 1985 Reagan-Gorbachev declaration that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And interestingly, I think about a year ago or thereabouts, you know, was repeated by all the leaders of the N5, as I prefer to call them, rather than the P5. And it was on that basis, the basis of that admission, that we went from 60,000 nuclear weapons held by the US and Russia to roughly a sixth of that today. And the idea that, you know, a nuclear war cannot be won has the air of a truism now. But I think it's important, and she points this out, and I think it's a great observation by a great woman, actually, that it's important to look at the corollary of that idea. A nuclear arms race cannot be won either. And the reason this nuclear arms race cannot be won is that the technology that is driving it, the ability to be able to integrate these very difficult to understand technologies, and I say that seriously because I know from speaking to some of the fundamental developers of this that they don't fully understand some of it themselves. But this is moving on, and in the age of quantum computing, which is about to come to us, this will change significantly again. And this is my last sentence. We've never been in an arms race where when the humans think they've won it and stop, the machines may be capable of continuing to run, and that's the real problem.
Thank you so much. Congressman Tierney, how do you see the joint threat of two nuclear peers, China and Russia, to U.S. security? And in your view, how should the U.S. respond to this new challenge?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everybody for inviting us here today, and those of you that came to talk tonight. But I also want to know how he got the questions in advance. No, we did. We did. Reminiscent of trying to cheat in school, but we got them ahead of time anyway. But thank you for inviting us. Thanks to our co-host on that. And I think what's interesting about this is it's fine that we're all talking about the intersection between artificial intelligence and NC3 and all the ramifications of that. But that's a fine point, and I like the fact that this is set in the context the next few days of not forgetting that this is all really about eliminating eventually nuclear weapons, because we can play around at all of this intermediary business as much as we want. But in the end, it's going to be a question of how big is the risk, how you mitigate it as much as you can. But as long as there are nuclear weapons, none of us are out of the woods. And that's going to be the job of a lot of people around the world who aren't nuclear states, continuing the drumbeat that they've started now, finding this totally unacceptable that we don't, that we're relegated to the idea of trying to figure out, for instance, now China and Russia starting an arms race, or arguably the United States starting it with their so-called modernization program. But everybody is all of a sudden engaged and going in a direction we thought we had reversed in the 1980s. It's like, as Yogi Berra, a baseball player, for those of you not familiar with American sports or whatever, is it's deja vu all over again. You know, here we are, we started in the 1980s with the freeze movement. People got alarmed, people took to the streets, people started passing resolutions around the world. You have the physicians groups, the women's groups, right on down the line, and the pressure got to the point where Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev finally had to do something. And to their credit, they both were educable on the issue. I mean, Ronald Reagan was about as far away from being a person you would expect to have reduced nuclear weapons than anybody. But he eventually learned from the people that he had around him, the staff and everything, that this was a real problem, something you should be concerned about, and he tried to respond to it on that basis. So the fact that Russia and China are sort of near peers to the United States, I would only argue a little bit with the contention. Russia, of course, is, and it has been the subject of negotiations. China is not there yet. China is a considerable distance away from being a peer of either Russia or the United States, but they're certainly concerning in that they're moving in that direction. But what's important to note is if we really think that the only purpose of having nuclear weapons is to deter your adversaries from using what they have against you, then just like Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to President Biden, said, you don't need to go tit for tat. You don't need one for every one that they have in order to deter them from using it. And a good example of that is North Korea. They don't have anywhere near, what Russia or the United States or even China or India or Pakistan have, but nobody wants to mess with them with the thought of them sending over what they do have to anybody that could be on the receiving end of it. So the idea is, what is your level of deterrence? How much do you think you need if you're going to have them and you think deterrence works, and that's an arguable point, how much do you think you need to stop the other side from coming against you? And it certainly isn't necessary to have one for each of what they might have in their arsenals on that. And it means that the United States is going to have to respond by determining how they would target, now that there are two that are going to have sizable amounts of that, and what they would do for usage on that. But what they really ought to be doing is ramping up their efforts to re-engage on the disarmament aspect on that, the arms control, and try to get us back there. Not easy, and other questions, because we've had a sneak peek of them, we'll address some of this. But the idea is that, there are other things the United States can and should do, to start us moving back in the right direction.
Thank you so much for these amazing answers. So, Dr. Waslekar, should the international community prioritize nuclear disarmament over other forms of military reductions?
I don't know how many of you have seen Oppenheimer, the movie. If you have not seen, there is this conversation between Einstein and Dr. Oppenheimer at the end of the movie, and Oppenheimer tells Einstein that when I was asked to do the Trinity test, I warned the US administration that we have just started a cycle of self-destruction of the entire world. And of course, the Trinity test happened and it had its negative consequences, but the world didn't get destroyed. But Oppenheimer says now, looking at the situation so many decades later, I feel that the process of destruction of the world has started. And Christopher Nolan made this movie mainly because he was worried that even though there was a risk of total destruction of the entire earth, the US administration took the risk and decided to go ahead with the test. Your question whether nuclear disarmament should be, or disarmament generally should be given a priority over other means, is this that I really believe that we have started a process of destruction of entire human civilization. We are currently, as human species, living in the most dangerous epoch in the history of humanity. Homo sapiens came into existence about 200,000 years ago. Never before has the planet Earth or human civilization or humanity experienced the kind of dangers that we are experiencing today, and that's the danger of extinction of human civilization, or in fact extinction of all kinds of life forms on the Earth. And it's not only because of the existence of 10,000 nuclear warheads, which is much less than, as Lord Brown said, than what it existed in 1980s, and it's a good progress, but 10,000 is far too many. But it's also because there is this growing marriage between new technologies like artificial intelligence, cyber technology, and weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons as well as other weapons, biological weapons. And therefore, we are at the risk of a global nuclear war, either by intent, or by incident, or by accident. If a nuclear Frankenstein did not take place during the Cold War, it was not a fluke. There were a number of episodes which are known as close calls when the world would have been destroyed. There was an incident in the 1980s when an early warning system in Moscow spotted 5 missiles going towards Russia, and Andropov was the leader of the then Soviet Union, and the Air Force officer in charge was one Mr. Petrov, and he saw these 5 missiles coming, and he decided that this was a computer mistake, and that he would not ask the high command to retaliate. Now, this was a big risk that Petrov had taken, because Andropov had a KGB background. He was known to be an extremely ruthless leader, and if Petrov had made a mistake, he would have been not only killed, but he would have been tortured and killed. Still, he took that risk, and he decided that this was a computer mistake. It was not an attack, and he didn't warn. If he had warned, the Soviet Union would have launched a nuclear missile attack. So there have been many such incidents, and we are living really in a dangerous time.
Thank you so much. And there's a book that you wrote, Sandeep Vasakar. It's A World Without War, where you highlight these events. Thank you so much. So I'm going to now pass the floor back to Congressman Tierney. Is it realistic to expect global powers to agree on mutual reduction of nuclear arsenals, given their geopolitical interests?
Well, I'd like to answer yes, but I think that's long range. Obviously, we have the geopolitical problems that we have right now that mitigate against that, and I think as long as Putin has decided he's going to use the threat of nuclear weapons use in order to try to achieve his attacks on the sovereignty of Ukraine, then we have difficulty there. And getting him back to the table is going to be difficult. There's going to have to try to be some effort at resolving that situation, and part of that effort of resolving the Ukraine-Russia situation could be an assistance by the United States and others that they re-engage in the disarmament process, which in effect would be a plus for Putin because it gets him back involved in international affairs, which I think he wants to do eventually, wants to try and play in that arena, but would have the benefit to everybody else, the United States and the rest of the world, of trying to restart those negotiations for which people are withdrawing on that. So I think that, that's important on that. We already have, China willing to engage at least initially on a discussion of the effects of AI and maintaining a human in the loop. Conversation started last May with President Xi and President Biden, and hopefully we could continue on with that. And maybe the Chinese could be effective in working with India and the United States and others in persuading Putin to get back involved in that conversation. So yes, at some point I think we can get there. and move in that direction. In the meantime, I think everybody else has to start doing what they can do to raise the confidence level and the trust level and find other arenas where they can engage. We were talking earlier about the fact that disengagement or lack of dialogue has become a real problem. And I think it's happened internationally, but I can say from my former colleagues in the United States, both parties are trying to compete with who can hate Russia or China the most and try to impress their electorates with just how tough they are. And their answer to being tough is to sort of pull back, saying the military can't talk to the military. We don't want academics traveling from one country to another. We don't want to engage, which if they were to stop and think about it would be lunacy. And shows the ignorance of every one of them. And they're not necessarily ignorant people in the sense of pejorative nature. It's just ignorance to the fact in the history. Nothing ever got resolved without conversation and dialogue and transparency and the building of trust. And so at some point, they're going to have to wake up to that fact and try to get that going again. And we have much to talk about, whether it's climate change or whether it is world poverty or whether it is energy issues. There are a lot of things that we can engage on and try to hope to get those periods again. I always say to people, look, there are existential issues. There's climate change, there's pandemic, and there's nuclear. It's just one of them gets you in 30 minutes. All right. The others we've been working on for some time, we'll continue to work on, hopefully in a positive way. But one of them, one mistake, just one, and it's over. So I think, that's the importance of trying to get that to happen and try to find some way to start the mutual reduction again and keep on pressing in that direction.
Thank you so much. And we are now going to talk more about the whole geopolitical context and nuclear weapons. So let me go back to Lord Brown. What role can the United Kingdom play on nuclear issues when it is dominated by the big three?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't speak for my government, although it is a Labour government. So I want to make that clear. I'm an independent contractor here as far as this is concerned. I do support the government, but this in answering this question, I mean, I first of all have to point out that with this new government, and this is not unusual, there's a strategic defence review currently underway, which will report in the first half of next year. So I'm not going to give too many hostages to fortune away, and certainly I don't have enough contextual information about that process successfully to second guess their provisions. But there's some pretty immutable strategic imperatives that won't change in relation to the UK's ability to play a substantive role in nuclear issues. I think we should, well, first of all, it's already clear that the new government is committed to maintaining and continuing the modernisation of the nuclear deterrent. And indeed, that's part of the formal remit of the SDR. So we can be sure that the UK will be continuing to operate in this context in a very similar way than it has been for the last few decades. Indeed, Article 5 of the Mutual Defence Agreement between the USA and the UK, under the provisions of which we receive material essential to our deterrent, was recently amended to remove the expiry provisions and to operate on an enduring basis. So this is a pretty clear signal that our commitment to deterrence will not change at any point soon. But the UK has spent decades building a reputation among nuclear weapon states as the most, in proportionate terms, forward-leaning on reducing the number of nuclear weapons and advancing the disarmament element of Article 6 of the NPT. I doubt if there's anybody in this room that doesn't know what I'm talking about when I say Article 6 of the NPT, but it essentially is the corollary for the deal that the real heroes of the best treaty that the world ever had and still has was that the non-nuclear weapon states would desist from developing nuclear weapons, and they're the real heroes of it. The corollary to that is Article 6, which is that the nuclear weapon states who enjoyed the ability to continue to be would work collectively to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And I remember in 2007 when I was the Secretary of State for Defence making a speech in this, not in this very room, but in this very city about that, which I'm not entirely sure if I deserve the credit for having created the N5 or the P5, but it didn't meet before I made the speech, and it meets now regularly and has done over a period of time, and it was meeting with positive results as far as I can remember, but Other geopolitical circumstances, which nobody needs to have explained to them, have made that much more difficult. Although there is something going on presently under the Chinese leadership of this about fail-safe, which we may get to later in these questions, that looks to be, a very positive thing. And my colleagues in the Nuclear Threat Initiative are very strongly pushing this and have been responsible for a lot of what's happening there. But we can talk about that later. But so when I was Secretary of State for Defence, transparency about our weapons system, both to explain that it was the minimum deterrent and the fact that it was the minimum was credible. We've been clear for decades that we have a nuclear arsenal to deter nuclear armed adversaries and to prevent nuclear blackmail. I mean, there is a reasonable argument that the only legal basis for having nuclear weapons in terms of international law, and the international law of war and other things, is to have them for deterrent purposes. But so, and for the prevention of nuclear. We never said explicitly it was its sole purpose. We rather made clear that we were deterring existential threats. And interestingly, in those days and until very recently, there really was only one existential threat, but there are now four. There is pandemic, which we've all experienced, which could be existential and much more likely, in my view, to probably wipe out humanity on the face of this earth than anything else. And I think its close second is climate change. And the third is nuclear weapons, which have been there all the time, and now we've added artificial intelligence to this. And, the interesting thing about this quartet is that they are existential risks which, if they manifest at the existential level, none of us will be safe from unless we're all safe from them. Which is why it was a mistake, not to vaccinate Africa first and get rid of the petri dish for these sorts of bio problems when we realized that we could vaccinate against pandemic. So we have to see all of these risks on a global basis, because none of us will be safe unless we're all safe from them. Anyway, so unfortunately, the government of the United Kingdom in the 2021 integrated review slightly altered the calculus in all this history of decades. Prior to 2021, we had a stockpile of 225 warheads. Following that review, the cap in the nuclear stockpile will increase for the first time in decades. I don't think actually we've ever turned that tick up before, but the previous government provided no time frame for achieving this, and they didn't publish transparency. They stopped deliberately not saying the numbers. And this is the role that we can play. I think it would be worth this new government, and I'm trying to persuade them to do this, considering restoring the commitment to transparency. One of the distinctive roles I see for the UK is restoring its position as a leading advocate for an overtly minimalist approach to nuclear weapons. The point that John was making in the introduction, how many do you actually need of these weapons, which could change the weather patterns? 2 of these modern weapons could change the weather patterns for half the population of the globe and cause death by starvation. Yeah, and without transparency, this is inherently challenging. So I think that's the role for the United Kingdom. If I can persuade the government that I support and of the party that I support, then that's what it will be.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about President Putin and his updated Russia. He has just recently updated Russia's nuclear doctrine. And now, according to it, if a non-nuclear state with the aid of a nuclear power threatens the country's sovereignty, it will be considered a joint threat, and Russia can respond with nuclear weapons. So what's behind Putin's decision, and how will it impact the fighting in Ukraine, and how should the West respond? I'm going to start now with Dr. Waslekar. Why do nuclear doctrines exist, and how important are they?
Well, before I answer your question, Christina, I just want to respond to one point which was made both by Des Brown and John Tierney. And they both referred to the existential crisis faced by humanity, not only on account of nuclear arms race, but also pandemic and overreach of some of the technologies. And what we have today is that some of these crises, which they have mentioned, and one or two others, they are civilizational crises. But our response is very nationalist. So whether it's pandemic, the response to pandemic was every nation was trying to respond to it from its nationalist point of view. There was even a race to make your nationalist vaccine. The response to the nuclear arms race is also very nationalist. And how can I protect my national interest as against? So I think we have to recognize that there are some civilizational crises, and civilizational crises require a civilizational response. And therefore, any revision of the Charter of the United Nations, a lot of it is focused on just reform of the Security Council. But what we need is a civilizational crisis response council, which is not based on nationalist representation, but which is based on with a more civilizational, more global kind. Now, coming to your question of doctrine, well, doctrine is a set of beliefs, and you have doctrines which kind of announce your intent, but a statement of intent is not always necessarily implemented in its true spirit. There are so many times a doctrine signed or issued by many countries, including recently there was a conference on the responsible use of AI in nuclear weapons in Korea, and one of the conclusions in the statement was that we must respect international humanitarian law. Now, this is a doctrine which has been completely violated by the Western countries. Anybody who is giving arms to Israel, anybody who is selling arms to any other conflict zones is violating the international humanitarian law. So there is a doctrine in theory, and there is a doctrine in practice. What we are hearing about the change of doctrine in Russia, and this is the second time the doctrine has been changed in the last 6 months on the nuclear question. But we have to see what are the implications in theory and what are the implications in practice.
Thank you so much. Congressman Tierney, what role do these nuclear doctrines serve, especially when they are altered, as was recently done by Russia? And do you think the US and NATO member states will change their nuclear doctrines as well in response to Russia?
Well, I think the role they play, as was mentioned, is that they attempt to set a group of norms or beliefs that countries will adhere to and reinforce against one another. If others want to play in the international community, be respected by others, be included in different decisions on important matters, then they want to be seen in the light of keeping these norms. Obviously, currently, at least Russia has decided they don't care about that. They're more interested in using them as a threat, which brings us to the point of I guess, threatening to use nuclear weapons can only be marginally less than using them, right? It's still a problem, a serious violation of responsibilities on that. But the response to it ought not to be that we all start changing ours and degrading them, but we ought to just reinforce them, speak more forcefully about it, and the rest of the world community is going to have to try to find a way to enforce it on all the nuclear states, not just Russia, but the United States and China and everything. And they've started this at the UN. They've made a good move toward that, but hopefully they won't lose their energy or their focus, and they will continue to insist that others follow in line and be as adamant as they always have been in order to keep them. And hopefully, in the long run, we'll move back in the direction. I think trying to force Russia into bringing their norms back in line with the rest of the world will be somewhat resolved if the Ukrainian issue can be resolved. And maybe it ought to be a part of that resolution.
Thank you so much, Lord Brown. I'm very keen to know what implications Russia's new nuclear doctrine will have on European support for Ukraine. Do you think the recent escalation might slow down European support to Ukraine, and will it force a rethink for France and the UK? I never ask easy questions.
Yeah, well,
But you do good in advance.
yeah, the list of questions you sent me had a preface to this, so I'm going to answer that question first, even if you didn't answer it, because my preparation to give you an answer. Depends, the logic of it goes like this. So the previous question, I'm now going to ask myself a question and answer it, was President Putin has updated Russia's nuclear doctrine, which we know and which has been discussed. Now, if a non-nuclear state with the aid of a nuclear power threatens his country's sovereignty, it will be considered a joint threat, and Russia can respond with nuclear weapons. So the question I was prepared for was what's behind Putin's decision. I don't know how I'm going to answer that, but how will it impact the fighting in Ukraine, and how should the West respond? So I hope I've reflected this doctrine properly. But I mean, first of all, my answer to this question directs you and the audience to something else. I mean, I'm going to preface this and the next question by saying that the European Leadership Network, which I chair and have done for the last 14 years, has many policy experts working in this area who could answer this question and offer a depth of analysis, which thankfully time constraints prevent me from trying to emulate because I wouldn't do it properly. But there was suggests, and I think this is right, that it's yet further evidence of President Putin attempting to use nuclear blackmail to shape the context of the military operations in Ukraine. He's lowered the nuclear threshold via this doctrine because he's relied too heavily thus far on issuing nuclear threats, and each instance of that has diminished their effectiveness. His nuclear blackmail has not prevented the West, from providing targeted economic aid. It's not prevented the provision of F-16s, and the announcement of this new doctrine didn't prevent the US and the UK licensing the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles within Russian territory. However, as is obvious, Russia's possession of a nuclear weapon has so far precluded direct NATO military intervention, thankfully. But the fact that Putin, after firing a nuclear-capable experimental missile into Dnipro last month, the fact that he chose to notify the US Threat Reduction Center to prevent the risk of misinterpretation and therefore escalation is, I think, and there's a man in this audience, I think, who could tell me whether this is the right psychology or not, is a sign that he's not acting without a thought for the consequences. His calculations, however wrong, remain just that, I think, calculations rather than impulses. The significant part of this updated doctrine is the inclusion of a threat to Russian sovereignty as a precondition for deploying a strategic nuclear weapon, but that term is hedged about with deliberate ambiguity. The semantic sort of elasticity of the word sovereignty can be stretched to encompass a threat to the current political regime in Russia. In other words, Putin's own position as president, or to the integrity of Russia as currently defined by its borders. But given, I think, his persistent disregard for treaties and norms, it's important to remember that this doctrine is almost entirely symbolic in nature. It's a signal to the West, not a revision of a set of internal constraints. And for that reason, I believe our own response should be a signal too, that we will continue our military support for Ukraine as long as they want it and need it, and that we will be considered in dealing with a nuclear armed power, but not allow the possession of a nuclear weapon by a strategic adversary to prevent us from supporting a state which has been the subject of their unprovoked aggression. So the answer to your specific question is, and it's obvious now, I think, in light of what I said earlier, which abutted on this subject that you asked, my answer will be unsurprising, and it's short, or it should be inconceivable that Western governments should allow this new doctrine, at once a naked threat and hedged about with studied ambiguity, to prompt us to diminish our support for the Ukrainian people. Speaking of ambiguity, in the light of the recent US elections result, maintaining European support for Ukraine is critical. In May last year, I suggested in a debate in the House of Lords that Putin's military strategy then in Ukraine led me to suspect that he was measuring progress in the conflict as much by Western electoral cycles as by more conventional military metrics. If the warning inherent in these words is to be confounded, then France and the UK and Europe more widely must act as concertedly as possible in continuing to support the people of Ukraine. Of course, the attitude of the incoming US administration will be important, and to some extent asking about European support for Ukraine without the knowledge of the attitude of the incumbent President Trump. Sorry, not the incumbent President Trump, but the elected President Trump is a bit like Hamlet without the prince.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Congressman Tierney, what can stop the cycle of escalation in Ukraine since the Biden administration has approved Ukraine's use of Western supplied long-range missiles against Russia? And Russia has retaliated with the use of a ballistic intermediate range Russian missile, as Lord Brown just mentioned.
Well, I mean, that's almost impossible question to answer on that basis. Who knows what's going to stop the cycle if everybody keeps going in the direction they're going? And you would hope they want. It's going to have to happen around a context of some effort to come to an agreement on how that issue is resolved. I think I mentioned earlier, and we all know, that nothing ever gets resolved in a battlefield unless somebody wins totally over somebody else, and that does not appear to be in the cards on this particular conflict, at least. So at some point, the parties are going to have to get to a table and start discussing a resolution. Now, Rose Guttemiller has an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. For those who haven't had a chance to read it, might look at it. She proposes a way for a win-win conversation that could have each of the parties that are involved in this conflict come away with something that might lead them to resolve the issue and stop the escalations on that. I think right now, in order for that to happen, there's going to be a lot of world pressure on the situation because neither Ukraine or Russia seems to be in the mood or feel that they're in a position where they have to negotiate. So either there's going to have to be a change on that, which just leads us to the escalation problem, or the rest of the international community is going to have to start getting very forceful and loud on their efforts to try and push these parties together. Huge roles for India to play, for China to play, and others if they choose to step up and be leaders in that regard and put people on the table. Who knows what the Trump wildcard is when he comes in? I certainly don't have a lot of confidence in it, but others may. But the fact of the matter is, what you don't want is a capitulation that leaves Putin with the mind that use of threat of nuclear weapons is an effective tool, and that others that want to gain sovereignty or go into somebody else's sovereignty can use that, in fact. So whatever negotiated resolution has to be an answer to making sure that that isn't a successful strategy.
Thank you so much. Dr. Voslikar, what are your thoughts on how to stop the escalation in Ukraine, and what can be done when P5 discussions are deadlocked?
I think, first of all, we have to understand what is the Ukraine conflict. Looking at it from the West, it's defined as a conflict of interest. So in the West, they think that the Russians are interested in acquiring territory that to expand or protect the Russian interests. Looking at it from the other side, it's more a conflict of values, where the West wants to protect and promote the values of democracy and freedom, and Russia wants to protect and promote the values of security and respect. So the very definition of conflict and the understanding of conflict is varied. And if you want to resolve this conflict, you have to first of all understand what the conflict is about. And if it is a conflict of interest, then obviously the solution that you are going towards is about what kind of territorial compromises you want to make, what kind of security guarantees you want to have, so on and so forth. But if you are looking at it as a conflict of values, then the real question is, how do you ensure the security of Europe, of Ukraine, and of Russia? Not just of Ukraine, but of all the three players. And from Russian point of view, their security is a major concern. Mind you, keep in mind that in North America, Europe, and Australia, and New Zealand, and Japan, there is a strong understanding and support for the Ukrainian perspective of the conflict. But in the rest of the world, including India, China, large parts of Africa, large parts of Latin America, Middle East, there is no acceptance of the aggression or invasion, or the principle of invasion, but there is a strong sympathy for Putin. In India, Putin is extremely popular. No Indian government will be able to take any kind of a position on this war which is not sensitive to Putin's position. It's not up to the Prime Minister or the government. There's a massive popular support and elite support for Putin. And it's the same with China, it's the same with large parts of Middle East and many countries. So I think the West has to think why 70% of the world's population is appreciative of Putin's position in this war, even though they don't accept the idea of invasion. This is something the West really has to think. And so if you don't understand that, and if you are just trying to look for some kind of a territorial compromises, it's not going to be resolved. I think ultimately, in the long run, and by long run, I mean it can take 20 years, 30 years, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years, Europe needs to reinvent the Kellogg-Briand Pact. That's what.
Thank you. Yeah. I think Lord Brown wanted to respond to your comments.
Well, thank you, Esteemed. I mean, I find myself in a situation I didn't think I would get into in this discussion, because having read a large part of your book, I thought that we would agree about almost everything. But I think this issue of values deserves to be addressed. And I'm conscious that I'm doing this as a British person, you know, and I actually founded the European Leadership Network, which covers Europe of the OSCE, and deliberately, you know, brought into its membership those countries of the OSCE who were at the margins. We didn't develop this from the centre, you know, from the United Kingdom, France, Germany. We went to the outskirts. We went to countries who would not consider themselves to be invited into anything. And so we had Turkish, we had Ukrainian, we had Russians. You know, we've built this very clearly on the basis that everybody's views are valuable and should be listened to. And in particular, some of us should learn to see ourselves as others see us. And we should all learn to see ourselves as others see us. I represented a part of Scotland where a very famous poet called Robert Burns wrote those very lines in a prayer that he wrote, you know, that God should give us all the gift to see ourselves as others see us. And I kind of live by that. So I'm not dismissing, I mean, I kind of understand because of our imperial and, you know, our empire and the legacy that we, the Brits, have left around the world, understand why in some circumstances people are not jumping to be on our side of any argument. But I think we've got to be careful about this argument about values that comes out of Russia for this reason. I'm going to tell you an anecdote. I went to Valdai on one occasion and shared a platform with a man who's a propagandist. I won't mention him because I'm going to talk to you about what. And he made this speech, this Lavrov speech about values, that in fact what the Russians are doing is that they are, by the way in which they're deploying their resource, protecting the values that we have given up on, and that they are therefore the heroes in this in this developing sort of narrative. So this man whom I have known and is a propagandist, and I knew him when he was the liberal voice of his president, President Putin, was sitting beside me in a situation like this. And I said, once he'd given this speech, I said, Sergei, can we just talk about values for a minute? And I did this. I said to him, that's a very nice suit you have. Can you show me the label that's inside it? And it was a Savile Row suit. And I said to him, well, our sartorial values you like. You know, you come to London to get your suits. I understand that, but our sartorial values, I know you have children. Where were they educated? In the best universities, in American universities and in British universities. I said, they must be very dear to you. You allowed us in the developing years of your children, you know, to come into our institutions. And I said, but the real question is, where's your money? Is it in a Russian bank? And he kind of laughed and went on. We've got to be really careful about this argument of values. It's a false argument in many cases. You know, they are not preserving our values or the values of the rest of the world. And in relation to Ukraine, you don't even have to go into that level of sophistication about the psychology of all of this, because Putin told us why he did it. He told us that Ukraine did not deserve to exist as a separate country, that it was properly part of Russia, and it needs to be reinstated. He's told us. We know why. It is about the land. And to some degree, I think it's also about his ability to be the leader of the current regime in Russia. And personally, I think the European Union are a bigger threat to us being able to do that, should Ukraine become a member of the European Union and flourish, than NATO is at all. So there are different ways of looking at these things, Sandeep, and I accept and respect your view about this, but I think we've got to be careful about where the element of disinformation distorts this discussion.
Thank you so much. We're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about the nexus of emerging technologies with nuclear systems. The new risks presented by emerging technologies destabilize the deterrence landscape. We will now focus on evaluating artificial intelligence AI risks, in particular the risks posed by the use of AI in NC3 systems. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term NC3, it refers to nuclear command, control, and communications. We will discuss whether the Nuclear Five should make a joint declaration about retaining human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons. Lord Brown, what is the new Labour government's position on the use of AI in the military domain? And what are your ideas about how to reduce the risks associated with integrating AI into nuclear systems?
We do have this strategic defence review going on, at the moment, and I'm not part of it. So I'll give you a provisional assessment, I think, but it'll become obsolete and misleading very quickly if the SDR reports in a different way. I think it's important to frame, this particular part of the debate, so risks as well as the exquisite capability that these new technologies can give, are given their due weight. I spend a lot of time talking to people about artificial intelligence and its many manifestations, its potential, but also its risks. I quite often find that I'm in conversations with people who see these exquisite capabilities and cannot see beyond that. And they're so desperate to have them that they are willing to take on the risks without working out what they actually are, if you can identify them. But we all know these risks. We know, for example, the effect that using in real time the identity of people in crowds can be distorted, because the data that educated the technology did not have enough black faces in it to be able to do this with any degree of certainty. I spent a couple of nights ago 2 hours with the survivors of the abuse of young women and girls by deep fake porn. In our country, 99% of deep fakes that are created by generative AI, and they are created instantly of apps that people have in their phones. 99% of them are created for the purpose of revenge pornography. They are, every single one of them, that has been produced and put out in the net has destroyed some woman's life. It's never done to men, and it's their image, who they are, is taken from them without consent and turned into this for reasons of misogyny and revenge pornography. And there is no example of the many thousands of women to whom this has been done to, women and girls, of any woman who ever consented to that being done to her by this technology. So I just think that we need to, in area after area, politicians, and I'm very conscious of this, and their advisors have to get beyond being captured by the capability. I mean, every conversation I see on the front page of a newspaper starts off with the ability of artificial intelligence to be able to scan breast cancer screening at the speed of light, and to be able, therefore, to identify women who may be subject to that for the future very quickly and let them get treatment. And I think this is fantastic, but there are many other things happening with this technology that don't bring that level of positivity. And we need to be able to admit that that has to be dealt with. And actually, we are told every year by experts in this technology who traditionally now sign a letter telling us that we politicians need to stop them doing what they're doing because it is so dangerous, many of these people. And we need to embrace them. And going back to the point that Sudeep made about how important what happened in the United States after the bomb was tested. And what actually happened was the people who were involved in this got together to say, how could we regulate this if our political leadership got to the point where they wanted us to do it? And over decades, they worked together, and they didn't just work together in the United States. They worked together with Russians and others to say, if we ever regulate this, how will we verify it? How will we do it? What should we look for? And then when Reagan and Gorbachev wanted to do it, they were there for them. And that's what we need to do. We need to embrace those people from the technology who are skeptical about it to tell us how to do this. There is no way that any political group is going to be created from people who fully understand this technology and what can happen inside the black box, because many people don't know, even the people who develop it in many cases don't know what's happening inside the black box. We'll not do this unless we embrace the people with the technological and scientific ability to be able to do it. And that's where we should be working. That's the place. If these people get into a dialogue among themselves, they'll tell us how to do it, and hopefully we'll get it right, because we did get it right about weapon systems before, and we got so right about certain weapon systems that we have completely abandoned them. There were certain missiles that we got rid of for a period of time, which unfortunately may come back. We have bioweapons, and others have been completely restricted. And that's because the policymakers and the people who understood the risks got together and dealt with the risks, as well as the exquisite capability that is there.
Thank you so much. And there's the Bletchley Doctrine. I think that's already sort of highlighted the dangers of AI, and many countries have already signed that doctrine. I also saw that the European Union is doing a lot on that, and I think it's a very positive development. So let me shine a light on a more positive note. The presidents of the US and China met in Peru mid-November. You mentioned it. At the meeting, they affirmed the need to address the risks of using AI in military systems. And they also affirmed the need to maintain human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons. So do you think all countries can come together on this?
They're going to have to. I can't see the upside of any country thinking that the destabilization that can be caused by AI entering into the picture with nuclear command and control is a good thing for any country. And even Russia at some point is going to come to that realization and get back into conversations. Right now, it's a tool for Putin to use, and but withdrawing from those kinds of discussions or whatever. But I think President Xi gets it. And it started, and there's a lot of work to do on that. But I think the rest of the world certainly is going to get it and see the destabilizing effects of not doing it on that basis. But there's so much to talk about there. It gives cause for a lot of meetings, because it's not just about keeping a human in the loop. It's about dealing with all the other problems. And there's been good papers out on that. The Arms Control Association put one out, Michael Clare and others on that, about the subtext of all of that. What happens if the data going into the algorithms is no good? What happens if the intermingling of systems, the conventional and the strategic, raise concerns for different countries, and so on down the line? There's a lot to discuss. And from there are other issues, whether it's climate control I mentioned earlier, or other issues of which we all care. It puts a forum there to start these conversations and move forward. But the AI, I think, is the most disruptive and the one that most countries would be very, very concerned about. And I think that leads to them wanting to get engaged in this kind of a conversation, and hopefully then persuading others, Russia and others, that it's in their interest as well to get into that. And it's the world's interest that we all do it together.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Lord Brown, some countries, Russia and others, feel that AI, NC3, and other strategic stability issues should not be separated from the global geopolitical problems. How do you solve this dilemma, and where do you start? How do you address their concerns?
I mean, a precondition of decoupling AI NC3, from its wider strategic issue is trust. You can put in place as many systems and mechanisms as you like, to encourage nations to pursue separate dialogues on AI NC3. But if they don't trust each other, they won't work together. So in the short term, I think this is where track 2 diplomacy comes in. And it has a role for the longer term. I mean, old-fashioned diplomacy is really the only vehicle for resolving these issues. The lack of trust, and we live in an environment in which there's an extraordinary lack of trust. I mean, Sandeep helpfully described the reasons for some of this in the context for us. The use of nuclear weapons isn't just contingent on the temperament of those responsible for them, but if it becomes, an autonomous systems and evolving weapons technology, then we're in real difficulties, And so nuclear weapons could be detonated by accident. We know that. And to be honest, it didn't take artificial intelligence waking us up to that. We knew that they could be detonated in accident. I mean, command and control tells us that, and there are these things that we call near misses, which I think personally we should call them near hits, actually, that we all know, and that cause people to say that, they're not necessarily that sure that nuclear weapons have kept us safe. It's luck that's kept us safe. We've been very lucky that these weapons have not been gone off accidentally or been in, with people who have the sort of cyber capabilities set off deliberately for reasons. We've been lucky. But given that the bond of trust between Russia and the West, for whatever reasons, is fraying more every day, how realistically can we impute a lack of malign intention, even whether there was a case of something like that nowadays? So, I mean, we've seen all sorts of consequences coming from a lack of trust. I mean, when Antonio Guterres called in 2023 for a global regulatory watchdog on AI, and the then UK Foreign Secretary suggested that AI should support freedom and democracy and be consistent with the rule of law and human rights. Conversely, the Chinese ambassador demanded the freedom to establish their own national level regulations and accused certain developed countries, of seeking technological hegemony. So it's clear that at least one side of the bipolar relationship is already couching AI terms in the terms of an arms race, which is what started this conversation that we had. It's clear that we'll need, alongside continued attempts at fashioning broader global structures, we'll need a greater focus on siloing AI competition, so it doesn't become yet another dimension of the great power competition, which is what's driving a lot of what's going on in the world at the moment. Although imperfect, the means for doing this in respect of nuclear weapons offers a useful precedent, but the challenge for doing this with AI is exponentially greater. Nuclear weapons are relatively easy to track. We can be certain whether they've been deployed and their position is continually monitored. How can a robust verification and monitoring regime be implemented in respect of AI NC3? I have no idea how you would do that. And certainly if we don't get the experts to teach us how to do that, we're never going to learn. It's certainly difficult to envisage sufficient reciprocal transparency for the US and the Chinese AI companies to allow objective monitoring teams to examine their respective operations. I don't think we're going to get to that stage. But the precedents of nuclear diplomacy, I think, even at the height of the Cold War, shows that it can be done if the political will is there. It's about political will. You know, it's back to my point, you know, I mean, you can put any structures you like, trust isn't there, and if leadership isn't there, if we don't have leaders that are willing to do this, this is never going to happen.
Thank you so much, and I think you've just answered the next three questions for everyone else. So I'm going to jump to Congressman Tierney. Related to the current environment, how will the election of President Trump impact the nuclear debate? And Trump famously said he could end the war in 24 hours. Do you think the arch dealmaker could orchestrate a new deal on the reductions of nuclear weapons or arms control with Putin?
Really take the political side of me out and live with this one, but I'll tell you that it's an easy question. It's right. First of all, I have to argue with your concept this is the arch dealmaker. All right, this is a clown with a clown car trying to make the White House into a circus. All right, so that's pretty much let you know how I feel about the situation. But he has proven he's not an arch dealmaker. He botched Iran. He botched North Korea. All right, he's got 6 personal bankruptcies. The only deal that this guy makes is when he stiffs people and then tries to tie them up in litigation for the rest of their lives. So I mean, there's no, I think, a deal that you could say, show me that this guy Donald Trump put together that was effective or that improved anybody's life. But then you have to worry about which Donald Trump shows up. All right, is it the one that talks about his uncle who was involved with non-proliferation issues and he has a fear of nuclear weapons and thinks they're terrible things? Or is it the one that spouts out about fire and fury and I have more nuclear weapons than you have when he's dealing with Kim? So that's the problem. So do I think so? Who knows? I mean, I don't think we should argue against his proclivity to want to sit down and talk to people. Nobody argued that he shouldn't have that feeling and shouldn't want to engage with North Korea. But the fact of the matter is he's so unbelievably ill-prepared and surrounded by people that didn't know what they were doing, and he certainly didn't know what he was doing, that the thing just crumbled before it even started. He didn't understand Kim. He didn't understand the environment in which Kim was working domestically. He doesn't really understand the nuclear issue. He couldn't engage on an intellectual level on what you're going to be talking about for the next couple of days, but he can talk in these bold statements about I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and hope something comes together. But the only way that his hope that something may come together would ever be effective is if you have good, solid people behind him. You know, so you can have somebody that sets the direction if they have good backup. So far, the indications of who he thinks his backup is going to be, pretty scary. So the next hope is, well, those are the people that are going to be out front. Maybe they're his communications team. Maybe they're the ones that lead the circus. Who does he put in the positions that actually operate the government? You know, this deep state that he so much hates. But who's he going to put in there that actually know what to do with diplomacy, who actually understand the issues on a technical level, who know who to engage on other sides, and can put themselves in the positions of other countries and other leaders to understand what it is they have to take out of a negotiation as well as what we have to take out. I'm not optimistic that he's the person to do that. But again, maybe if even by mistake he puts somebody in that can do it, maybe there's an opportunity there.
Thank you. I have now one question for all three of you. And if you can be brief, because we're going to have a round of questions then from the audience. So let me just quickly ask all three of you. The N5's January 2022 statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, echoing the words of Oppenheimer, was an important positive step. Do you think the N5 should reaffirm this statement and build upon it with tangible risk reduction efforts and confidence-building measures and restore dialogue? Please elaborate on what you think would be the most positive way to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategies. So who would like to start? Please go ahead.
You know, I think that, yes, the United States and other countries should each rival each other to take the leadership role on this, starting with the artificial intelligence intersection with NC3. But moving on to that, who's going to make the statement that no first use, that all countries should? China has always proposed that. Some people don't want to take them seriously on that, and that's a way for them to avoid it. But the fact of the matter, what's been holding back the United States is that its allies that rely on the umbrella of the United States nuclear program object more than anybody about a statement on that basis, but that type of a statement made universally would be helpful. The statement that nobody will put nuclear weapons in space, reiterate that and clarify it on that basis, that nobody will start testing again. That no country, everybody pleased that they will not be the country that starts nuclear testing again. All of those things are grounds for statements of commonality between countries that could set a new series of norms or values on that and move people in the right direction. I think they're there for the taking.
Thank you so much. Who would like to continue? Dr. Weslaker.
We already have enough number of statements calling for, and treaties calling for abolition of nuclear weapons. You have TPNW, which has made nuclear weapons illegal. You have the Article 6 of the NPT, which reflects the commitment to abolish nuclear weapons. You have the January 3, 2002, 22 statement of the P5. So you have enough statements which and treaties which endorse the abolition of nuclear weapons. I think what is missing is a concrete time-bound action plan. You need a time-bound action plan. So what you need is a vision that, okay, we need to abolish nuclear weapons by, say, 2045 as an example, or could be any year, or 2050. And then you need, what are the first 3 steps or 4 steps that we need to do? And the first step could be, because it's a low-hanging fruit, is really what we are trying to do here, which is to have a P5 agreement on nuclear risk reduction emanating from the artificial intelligence. But then you have to look at no first use. You have to look at the restoration of some of the treaties which were abrogated or suspended in the last 10 years, like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the ABM Treaty. So many treaties have been just dropped. So what are those? So your question should be reframed to ask, what are the first 5 steps that the nuclear weapons state should take to move towards the realization of the objectives to which they have been legally and politically committed under Article 6 and under TPNW. So what are the first 5 steps? So let me ask that question to Lord Brown. What are the first 5 steps you recommend? So I mentioned the first one, which is the AI NC3 framework. What is the second, third, fourth, and fifth?
Well, I mean, your first one's not a surprise, considering what we're here to do in the city over the next 2 days. But so I recognise that, and I respect you for the contribution and what the GCSP and Foresight have done, in this area. I think it's a great deal of work, and we should work on this. But actually, there are out there 2 ways in which the P or N5 can live up to what they all agreed to not that long ago, that a nuclear war should not be fought because it cannot be won. And there is a responsibility on all of them to build on that. And there is a process out there of what is called fail-safe that is being internationalized very successfully. I have to say, thanks to the work of colleagues of mine in NTI and a number of people in the ELN and the Asia Pacific Leadership Network who have worked together to do this, that there is a dialogue which increasingly nuclear weapon states and maybe nuclear armed states will at least take the responsibility for ensuring that if they depend for their strategic security on these weapon systems, they need to keep them safe. And by safe, mostly, they need to keep them safe from the cyber, in a cybersecurity sense, so that if they integrate them into the internet, or if they bring in technologies that allow people to get into this NC3 space, that they are protecting them from that, so that they will not be used accidentally, or that they will not be set off deliberately by people who have the ability to be able to do that. I mean, that's among many things that are in the fail-safe review. And this is something that they can do without bilateral agreements, without multilateral agreements. They do it for themselves, for their own people, for the fact that they have it. And if they want these weapons for their strategic security when half the world don't have them, then they have to respect that part of the world's right, not only to live with the risk of those weapons by at least keeping them safe. So the internationalization of fail-safe review is important. And also the United Nations did recently come to agreement in large numbers, and unfortunately my government didn't vote for this, that we would look through the lens of modern technology and data at the humanitarian impact of the use of a modern nuclear weapon again to see exactly what it was. Now, this is important because if you have a look at this, you will come to the conclusion that the Red Cross did when they last did this, which is that there is no country in the world that could recover from the explosion of a modern nuclear weapon on its soil, and that there never will be a country that can do that. That was the best that could be said about it. But we have much more data now about this because of climate change and other things, because that's the space in which the effect of the climate, that the most people will die from the use of a modern nuclear weapon or a couple of them. But the United Nations now is going to commission work on that, and we should build on that. And these countries who have these weapons should be made to factor the humanitarian impact of these weapons for particularly the global south, because there is nothing but risk for these people in these weapons. They have no deterrence. They have no extended deterrence. They only have risk. They just live in a world in which the people who own these weapons, if they get out of hand, either accidentally or deliberately, or if they have a war, billions of people will die. And we can move into other spaces, but we need to talk to each other. We need to find space in which we can talk to each other, and we need to find space in which we respect each other's positions. If we don't do that, none of this is going to work.
Thank you. We have to leave a little bit for tomorrow. But I also wanted to say that I hope that all the N5 leaders watch this video, because I think you have all really highlighted the importance of the gravity of this issue. I'm now going to open the floor to questions. Who would like to ask a question? And you can identify yourself if you want to, but you don't have to. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Am I supposed to speak with or without?
Without.
Without, good. My name is Sergei Batsanov. I'm from Russia. I'm here in Geneva because I work for PAGOSH, Conferences on Science and World Affairs, having for a while Geneva office. The rest probably might be different at some point. And I also have several hats in Russia, including the director, or whatever it's chair of the advisory board of the first Russian non-governmental Center for Global Biosecurity Studies, and several other things. I know the time is non-existent. I would refrain from even starting, substantial exposés, but I would like to perhaps ask, don't you think that one of the problems or the reasons, many there are, why people started talking about artificial intelligence in various spheres, including nuclear, is that we do have a kind of a general depreciation or simply disappearance of knowledge in normal biological heads. I just give you one example, and especially at not necessarily at the highest level, but at the level close to the highest. I'll give you one example. We've been discussing nuclear doctrines. And the recent change of the Russian nuclear doctrine, which now allows kind of admits the possibility of launching a nuclear strike against a non-nuclear country which is fighting with Russia with the support of another nuclear weapon state. Now, it's not a recent change. There is a section of nuclear doctrines which is called negative security assurances. The initial Russian negative security assurance, in a doctrinal sense, was we would not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states which do not have those weapons on their territories, full stop. In 1995, when the discussion was about extending the NPT indefinitely, there was kind of idea that nuclear weapon states should come out with similar or same negative assurances. So that's when Russia changed its. Why did it change? Because especially the US and the UK were pressuring Russia to accept the following formula. I, a nuclear weapon state, would not use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state. There were nuances, party to the NPT maybe, and compliant party to the NPT, who determines compliance with the NPT. Unless that nuclear weapon state attacks me, non-nuclear, with support or together with another nuclear state. So this formula basically boils down to 95, starts in 95, and what happened in 95 was that Russia accepted, surrendered to the Western formula. Thank you. My point is that knowledge, we must not allow ourselves to lose knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there a question that anyone would like to ask? We just have a couple minutes left. Okay. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I would like to now thank all of you for coming tonight. I know this is probably the busiest time of the year, and I really applaud you all for being here. Before we close, I would like to thank all those who have helped organize this event, our video stream, Florian and Emmanuel for organizing it, for Constance as well. This is our final Geneva Security Debate for 2024, and we look forward to welcome you to our next series of debates in 2025. But finally, I would like to give a round of applause to our esteemed panelists for their amazing responses to the questions that I prepared for them. I also want to thank them for traveling so far to be with us today. I really deeply appreciate that. And in closing, I wish you all the best for this holiday period and for the rest of the year. I wish you a good 2020-25 and a more peaceful world. So let's give a hand of applause. Thank you so much. We can just do one photo. Sorry. We can just do one photo.